chapter 1, time erases all of our works, and in chapter 12, that happens to everybody. How do we kind of handle life? And as he has progressed from chapter 2 on through chapter 11, he seems to be working closer and closer to his end conclusions. And so chapter 10, chapter 11 is kind of saturated with a lot of very practical wisdom up until the time we get to chapter 12, where he draws his final conclusions. If someone would, let's read verses 16 through the end of the chapter.
Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your princes feast in the morning. Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles, and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not drunkenness. Because of laziness, the building decays, and through idleness of hands, the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry, but money answers everything. Do not curse the king, even in your thought. Do not curse the rich, even in your bedroom. For a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird of flight may tell the matter.
Thank you, man. So in verse 16 to verse 17, he compares two situations. One in verse 16 is whenever the king is a child and the princes feast in the morning, as compared to verse 17, when the king is the son of nobility and the princes feast at the proper time. So what's the comparison? Why is it bad for a king to be a child and for the princes to feast in
This
the
is
morning?
a ruler. He's over people.
Would you trust a 10-year-old with your personal finances? Or your credit card without any oversight? Okay. If you would not trust a 15-year-old, with your personal finances, why would you want to trust them with the entire kingdom? That's really the idea. And what does he mean by the princes feasting in the morning? Is there a proper time to feast?
Usually in the evening or on a holiday, not every morning.
Yeah. Sorry, no, there's not a proper time to feast. We are never sending you to Mongolian grilling or Brazilian cooking, whatever it is.
Sounds like it makes for a lazy day.
Yeah. If you feast in the morning, you're going to want to get up and do work in the afternoon. No, so he's in verse 17 gives you the idea that here are the princes who feast at the proper time. That there is a right time to do that, but that comes after all the work time. That comes whenever you can relax. What does he mean in verse 17 when your king is the son of nobility?
He's in his place.
When he's in his place? Is how it's phrased. How is it phrased in the King James? Son of nobles. Yeah. As you remember, right at the end of Proverbs, you have those couple of chapters that are written by other people. The king of the words of Argur, and then King Lemuel. Chapter 31 is a king who was taught by his mother how to be a king. How hard would it be for one of us who have never prepared for the role of leadership to just step up and be president tomorrow? Nigh impossible, right? How would you even begin to make decisions on a global scale if you've never been prepped for it? If you've never gone through any of those processes? And that's what he's speaking of. One in verse 16 is the king who's a child. And the other one is, here is a king who has been raised to be a king his entire life. He's been raised by nobles for this position. He's been trained for this. And so he says that woe to you in verse 16 is the land who this happens to. In verse 17, happy is the land when this happens. And he's speaking of these proper things. In verse 18, as Matt had read, through sloth the roof sinks in, and through indolence the house leaks.
Just one last thing on the last part of 17 there.
Mhm.
The princes are feasting at the proper time, and it's for strength and not for drunkenness. So there's a That's not a drunken, brawling feast. That's a very controlled, and it's for increasing the strength of the nation when they do that kind of feast.
Here in verse 18, he gives just a practical application that by sloth, the root sinks in, and through insolence, the house leaks. How does that kind of connect to the point that he's making throughout chapter 10?
You don't stay on top of things, they're going to decay.
Yeah. That is going to be the case. And that by just not doing anything, it's going to decay. And so he makes the point in verse 19 that bread is made for laughter, wine gladdens life, and money answers everything.
That's how you think when you're married. How's that?
So what does he mean that the bread is made for laughter, wine gladdens life, and money answers everything?
When you're feasting in that mindset, that's how you feel things are, not necessarily how they are in reality.
Okay, possibly.
Well, usually when we feast too, we think of it as the reason for joy or merriment, laughter. It's a festive occasion, usually when we think of a feast. And wine will make you merry, to a certain degree. And then, it's amazing how many problems are that money will solve, and take care of. If you're willing to pay the price or the cost. It's a great balm for whatever is the ailment,
It almost seems like it goes back, Chad, to the, well, I guess I would say it's the lack of wisdom in verse 16. A feast can result in laughter, but an overage of, there's a following on circumstance. Wine might make merry initially, but there's a following on circumstance. The focus of money and money solving your problems may be short-term, but there's following circumstances beyond that as well. There's unexpected collateral damage after all three of these.
Okay. Remember, he's been balancing in chapter 10 wisdom and folly and the mindset between the two. And I think John is getting pretty close to the mark that there is an intended purpose for these three things, for bread, for wine, and for money. In the same way that there is a purpose in verse 16 and verse 17 for the feasting and for the kingship. Like there's a purpose behind those things. Now the question between wisdom and folly is to what extent you take those things. If bread is only for laughter, then I think we have strayed into the realm of folly. If we think that wine is simply to gladden life, then we've slipped into folly. If we really believe that money answers everything, then we've slipped into folly. Now, can it do a lot? Yeah, it can do a lot. But if in your drunkenness you run over somebody's child, is money going to solve that problem? No. So, I mean, on a very practical standpoint, we understand that wine does not always gladden life. We understand the very practical standpoint that money does not answer everything. But in the mindset of wisdom and foolishness, these things seem to be true. But whenever we think about them soberly, with wisdom, we understand that these things were made for a purpose, but they are not the end goals of life. Is that a fair way to represent verse 16 or verse 19? And then in verse 20, even in your thoughts do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature will tell the matter. Is he really advocating that a bird is going to listen to you at your windowsill and he's really going to go and whisper to the king? I I highly doubt that Solomon has been getting whispers from the birds right before he sits down and writes Ecclesiastes. What's his point?
Doesn't matter if you say it, someone's gonna hear it, and it's gonna come back around. It's gonna be made known. You know, and the scriptures tell us, you can't do anything in secret. It's not gonna be found out, or in the dark, it won't come to the light. So that's what he's alluding to here. You know, it's the same thing. You speak evil of your leadership, it's gonna come back around. They're gonna hear that.
Over in 1 Peter, chapter 2. Now we're jumping out of Ecclesiastes for a second. But 1 Peter chapter 2, starting verse 17. This seems to be a practical thing to consider. Oftentimes we go over to Romans chapter 13 to talk about our relationship with government, because Paul, through our reading of his words in Romans 13, we make loopholes for ourselves that doesn't exist. You know, give honor to whom honor is owed. And we, oh well, I know who honor is owed to. It's not him. It's not her. Peter does not give us the ability to lay those loopholes. In fact, as you go through chapter 2 and chapter 3 in 1 Peter, Peter tells us that we are to show off the greatness of God. We are to demonstrate how great God is. And that really comes forth in unjust relationships. He starts with authority in chapter 2. He then goes into the master-slave relationship at the end of chapter 2, and then into the unfaithful husband-wife relationship in chapter 3. All three of those aspects of life he categorizes in the standards of, here's an unjust situation that you show off how great God is by your just actions. And in verse 17, in that mindset, he tells us to honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the emperor. Now, obedience and honor are not always synonymous. And maybe you see that mostly in your kids whenever they do exactly what you tell them to with just the most revolting look on their face. That you can see that they don't honor you at that moment. They're going to do it because you're going to, take care of their behind if you don't. But they're not going to do it with honor of their lips. And oftentimes we try to split hairs in a way that I think is actually impossible, that we're going to obey the government, but we're going to do it with no honor. And we're going to honor the position without honoring the person. And I honestly have no idea what that practically looks like. I don't know how you honor a position and then disrespect the person that God put in that position. So Solomon is phrasing it in the terms of a king, and in the terms of when you talk about them, not even in your bedroom. Peter is going to say, not just don't say it in your bedroom, you got to change the heart behind it, honor the emperor. Now, Peter writes during a time period where the emperor is not a godly person, and he's going to be writing to an audience that the emperor is going to go from worse to even more worse in the next couple of years. He's writing just before Nero, most likely, and he's going to be writing to an audience who's going to then have to suffer under Nero, and will have these passages in their hand to remind them, honor the emperor. It's hard. And so Solomon's words here in Ecclesiastes chapter 10 really kind of highlight something important for us. Now, oftentimes we are not only willing to say things in our own bedrooms, but we're willing to take to the airways and say them broadly anywhere. Peter makes a point not to use our freedom as a cover-up for evil. Do we have the freedom to say whatever we want to in this country?
Not really.
To some degree? Yeah, I mean, it's one of our 10, not commandments, that's not word. Bill of Rights. So my mindset is, it's one of our Bill of Rights, theoretically, for the most part, we're allowed to say what we want to. We have freedom in that. Peter says don't use your freedom as a cover for evil. we really need to consider what it means to curse the king. In our case, president, governor, whoever happens to be in authority. And we are far too quick to just completely abandon Solomon's words here. Even in your thoughts, do not curse the king.
Yeah, so many times saying that we have heard, or even we said ourselves, maybe us referring to the president, you may not like the man, but you honor the position. You may not like and agree with what the king has ruled, but you honor that position.
And I think to honor the position, you have to then show honor to the man as well. Any thoughts or comments to the end of chapter 10? Let's get into chapter 11. He starts off with another poem or a series of proverbs. If someone would, verses 1 through 4.
Cast your bread on the surface of the waters, for you will find it after many days. Divide your portion to 7, or even to 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. If the clouds are full, they pour out rain upon the earth. And whether a tree falls toward the south or towards the north, wherever the tree falls, there it lies. Who watches the wind? Who watches the wind will not show or will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. This is the American Standard.
So what does he, I think verse 1 and verse 2 go together very closely. What does he mean to cast your bread upon the waters, or to give a portion of 7 and 8?
Well, I think, if he's, go ahead.
Can you go ahead?
No, go ahead.
I think it seems to be that he's saying to be prepared to, you don't know what's to come, and to don't be wasteful.
Okay. So how does casting your bread?
I guess with number 2, verse 2.
Okay. And what was your thought, sir?
I was in agreement with her, and casting your bread on the surface of the waters, you will find it after many days. I don't know. I didn't give a whole lot of thought to that, but I think he's you don't store up or be stingy with things. I think you're kind of looking forward to what am I trying to say here? Or gain, I guess if I had to go back to Strong's here, just your bread or gain. So, whatever you gain, you can kind of share that around maybe, and it'll come back to you instead of, again, this goes back to my original thought that instead of being stingy with something, or hoarding it to yourself, you share it. And in doing so, it'll come back to you.
Jesus has a parable over in Luke that is very similar to this, not the exact same idea, but he talks about making friends by the means of unrighteous wealth or of money, so that whenever you're kicked out, you have someplace to return. It's the similar principle here that he's talking about. The idea is, if you're only generous to one person, for instance, and something happens, what's the chances that one person is going to be able to then to help you at the moment that you need?
It's gonna be slim.
It may happen, may not happen. They may be in a financial situation. They may not. They may be able to reach out to you right then, or they may not. But if you help 7 or 8 people, if you're generous whenever things are really good to a lot of people, what's the chances that one of them are going to be able to help you at that time?
The percentage of that goes up.
Yeah, it goes up a lot. So there's the idea of, you give a portion to 7 or to 8, but you may not know what disasters may happen on the earth. I think the same idea is very similar to verse 1 of casting the bread upon the waters. Anyway, do you know where things are going to go if you put it into a stream or if you cast it into the ocean? No. That's the idea of I'm going to do good, but not necessarily know what the end results are going to be. Now, he uses an analogy that I don't know fully makes sense to us. You know, I'm going to cast my bread in the water and then hope to get my own watery bread back a few days later. It's kind of a weird way of mentioning it. But he's talking about the idea of just here's an area where you don't know where the end result is going to be. And you cast your bread upon the water and you will find it after many days. That is the point. He then gets into two similar and yet dissimilar proverbs in verse 3 and verse 4. He makes the point that the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. If a tree falls, whether it's to the north or to the south, wherever it lands, that's where it's going to stay. What does he mean by that?
There's not partiality.
Okay.
It's not separated as into the north or the south is better than the other. The same with the rain. It's not segregated, maybe I should say it that way, to where it's just certain individual things.
Okay.
It kind of covers the whole thing.
Fine.
It kind of reminds me of what he said earlier about what is crooked cannot be made straight. I mean, if we spend all of our time worrying about the weather, or the wind, or the trees falling down on your field, or maybe you don't know sow or reap, you know, you're worrying about the circumstances instead of trusting in God.
I think you're right that he's mentioned a couple times what God has, back in chapter 7, verse 13, who can make straight what God has made crooked. Same idea that he gives back in chapter 1, what is crooked cannot be made straight and what is lacking cannot be counted. When things are really good, if you are at a point where you can be generous to 6 or 7 or 8 people at a time, do you think that there's going to be a point in time where things are going to go poorly? Sometimes. Hopefully, if you have wisdom, that is going to be the case. Are there a lot of people who get a windfall and then think, well, my luck's never going to dry up, the money's always going to be here? Yeah. I mean, that happens. Like, every time we have a recession, we find people who thought that things were never going to go poorly. You know, you can look at, I hate to use Hollywood for any example, period. How many people can make it big into one movie and they get a couple $1 million from that and they think, this is it, I've made it the big times, and blow all their money to begin with and then never get cast again. That happens a lot. I mean, we talked about the lottery, the same thing. Was it, it's like 75–80% of all lottery winners are broke within a year, thinking that it's never going to run out. I think he's getting here to the point that some of these things happen, and if the clouds are full of rain, it's going to rain. If the tree's going to fall, it's going to fall. There's not a whole lot we can do about that. And then he uses that kind of nature terminology in verse 3 to then go into the next one in verse 4. If you only observe the wind, if you only watch the clouds, what are you not going to do? Work. You're not going to work. No. You guys still have to work. That's the point. If you just sit around all day, you're not going to make money. You're not going to sow, you're not going to reap, you're not going to have what you need. And so he gives some really practical advice to life of to cast your bread upon the waters in verse 1. To give a portion to 7 and 8, recognizing that the clouds are dark and fat. It's going to rain on you sometime. It's just going to be the case. And remind you to continue to work in verse 4, not to be lazy. Any questions or comments? Verses 1 through 4? No?
Do you mind if I went back real fast, back to chapter 10? I was having a thought about verse 20, and I was thinking in my mind, and then you move forward. Verses 19 and 20 are interesting to me, and I don't know that I separate the talk between the two. As we talk about verse 19, there's a seeming on the surface of how something would be, but the reality after the fact is kind of hidden underneath that. And what our expectations of feasting or wine or money might result in, but the reality is not always what we see it as. But the cursing of the king and the cursing of the rich. And the latter part of that verse, that some little bird may tell you, well, the reason I don't curse the king and that I don't curse the rich through spiritual maturity is my heart. I don't care if a little bird's gonna tell me, my heart's not gonna allow me to do that anyway. And most of us who are adults have seen the reality of the cursing of leaders, of the cursing of the rich. The issues of the world, the church is not immune to those coming into the church and the conflicts and the divisions. And I've seen even Christians get so wrapped around the axle, is the term I guess we could use, in politics, that the example that they are within the world and their anger and their frustration and the divisiveness of them in engaging in politics has really ruined their heart. And the thought of cursing the rich, we see that from time to time. I'm reminded of Paul in Philippians chapter 4 that he was content whether abased or abound. He didn't care what situation he was in, he was content to be there because Paul preferred godliness as a heart. And the reality is, in a short number of years, none of us are going to exist anymore anyway, so our politics and our wealth don't matter. But cursing of the rich, I have to determine who's rich. Well, what if someone determines me to be rich? And then they have the same cursing. But our heart should not lead us to really ruin our example and our reputation amongst other people as godly people, where our main focus is the anger and frustration over politics or the jealousy, in most cases, over someone who's rich. I should be content where I'm at, and I should honor the king, not only just in his position, but I should honor the king, and I should honor the leader. And my heart shouldn't drive me to, why would I curse the rich? Why would I curse the situation someone else is in when I'm to be content in my own situation? I guess my point is, we can think we can curse the king or we can talk bad about rich people. There's an underlying negative to that will affect our heart if we're not careful. The same as the 3 in verse 19.
Good point. Here in verse 5 of chapter 11 it says, "You do not know the way of the Spirit, or way the Spirit comes to bones in the womb of a woman with child. So you do not know the works of God who makes everything." Is that a similar phrasing to the New King James or the New American Standard?
The King James says, "As you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with child, so you do not know the works of God who makes everything." New American Standard is just a little bit off, but it's the same thing.
This is maybe one of those verses that on the surface modern people would scoff at and say, "Ha, we do know how this happens." Do we really know how this happens?
No.
No.
We don't. Can we observe it a little more closely now? Yeah. Do we have a little more or a lot more explanation of the process? Yeah, I mean, somewhat. We understand a little more of it, but what makes a stem cell turn into bones? This is probably showing more of my ignorance than anything else. I understand that your DNA determines things about you. But how does that ever tell a bone to be the exact same size and shape that it needs to be, or identical on both legs, or to grow and attach? I have no idea how DNA is supposed to do that, where there's no overarching, there's nothing over all of the individual cells to say, okay, all of us are going to work together to do this. It doesn't still make sense. And sometimes we look at the small things, we know, yes, this is an explanation, but it doesn't explain the system. And that's what Solomon is getting at. Yeah, okay, sure, we can observe more closely, we can describe a bit more accurately how it happens, but we still don't know how God does it.
We're still in awe, is what we're supposed to do. And that was my thinking in the brother that was talking about the chapter before that. The reason we don't want to curse the king is because if we do, then we forgot who's always going to be in control. And when we lose that, then we start casting our bread sort of thing across the water and just hoping instead of knowing. If we put our trust in God, it's always going to come back to us in good.
You know, in the same way, you know, when Job questioned God, God says, well, do you know this? Do you know this? Do you know this? I mean, his omnipotence and his omniscience is so far beyond even us even considering that. And I just thinking, one of my sisters in Christ, she sent me a message yesterday, and she has a granddaughter, great-granddaughter, I'm sorry, that's been in the hospital for 2 months, and it has a congenital disease. She was only 3 months old when she was found with it, and she's been getting 12 chemotherapies, and they didn't think she was gonna live, and she messaged me saying they sent her home yesterday. And you know, that's praise the Lord, and the doctors admitted they don't know why she's alive. She's waiting to have a bone marrow transplant, but they're putting their trust in God, and that's what she said. You know, praise the Lord, you know, that we trust in Him. And, you know, man's never going to know it all. God just gives us enough to let us consistently know that He is. It's up to us to put our trust in that. You know, and sometimes I sort of struggle, I'm sorry, this is your worship service, but we start deciding how we should give of ourselves, of our money, of our lifestyle, but we don't know if we start choosing where we think it goes. Are we making the right choice? Are we putting our belief in God that whether it doesn't look good, that God can't turn it into something good later on? And we don't have to see the results. All we have to know is that we're obeying God and we're doing what He wants us to do. We don't have anything to lose, ever. You know, without that attitude, you know, we're sort of just living on the top, you know, and not getting deeper and putting our trust in it. And sorry.
Great point. That we don't know the work of God. Why is it that who's in power is in power? God put him there for a reason. Do I have to know what that is in order to honor the emperor? And that's going to be true for whoever is in power. It's going to be true for any of the events of life. It's not going to be, oh, okay, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to tell you exactly why, and then you can have faith and trust in it. And that God has given us a whole history of all the things He has done for His purpose, for His glory, and then He does what He does and tells us, have faith that this is going to be what it is.
You know, we see that God sets whom He will. And one of the things I hate that's going on in this country right about now, you know, here recent is the past 2 presidents I've seen, the hatred that I've seen, or the hatred that I saw in this country, it was scary. It was frightening. It didn't matter. You know, you got Obama, then you got Trump. Both times the hatred was there, and the hatred doesn't care. You know, and like the brother was saying, I saw it creep into churches. We're conservative, we're liberal. It was terrible, and now we see. Now we know that God put them there. We know that, but now, as we look at this right here, it says, "Thou knowest not what is the way of the Spirit." You know, but and then even so, God know not the works of God. We don't know how God does what He does, or why He does what He does in many cases. But you know, we kind of smart, and that shines every so often, and it really causes a ugly side of humanity to show up, even in the body of Christ. You know,
That's a great point, and you mentioned too, when we were talking about fear, the next emperor, the next Caesar that was going to come along was going to be Nero, and you think, well, would God allow Nero to come in and do all the horrible things, especially towards Christians, that he did? But then we're so many years away from that. If if you look back, I mean, we don't know, again, because God is the one in charge, but if we just try to figure out, and often in hindsight, we can see some of the answers better than we can right now while things are happening, but God sees everything. God knows what's coming in the future as well. And so with Nero, if we look back, why would Nero be there? What good did Nero do? Well, he killed a lot of people, a lot of Christians, but also the gospel spread to all the world. Would it have spread so much had Nero not been there and had been friendly towards Christians? Again, God knows, and maybe that's why, you know, I'm not saying I know the answer for why Nero was Caesar at the time, but often in our lives, the same things. We see some horrible thing happens in our life, and we're like sometimes even people lose faith, and you're like, I don't know why this thing happened to me. And then years later, you go, that was the best blessing I ever had. Like, I can't believe that God was so great and God was so good, even though at the time maybe my faith was wavering during that time. I think that applies to world leaders, or why bad things happen on a larger scale that we just don't understand at the time.
There's a real psychological principle that if you suffer for your belief, it usually solidifies, generally speaking, rather than it softens. And not predicting anything, but you know, how many of us thought about courage more in the last year and facing possible repercussions for our faith in the last 15, 16 months than we have in the last 10 years prior? You know, do you feel maybe a little more solidified to face a different kind of struggle in the future? I hope so. Yeah, I hope that this last hardship has then procured some type of an improvement on it. Now, would you have guessed this back in February of last year? I wouldn't have guessed it. I think this last year in February. Never would have known. Never would have guessed. Yeah, and isn't that kind of his point? Is that, you know, oftentimes we don't get to see any of the blessings until after.
And secret things belong to God,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where our faith has to be the strongest, is in those times that we can't put it together like a puzzle and get a complete picture. That's why the secret things belong to Him, and we have to trust Him to handle those things that are bothering us or driving us crazy, or why are you letting this happen to my friend, or whatever. So that's the hardest thing.
You know, a principle I say in my mind all the time, others probably heard me, if I want physical strength, I seek resistance. If I want spiritual strength, why do I want an easy road? It's the same thing.
Yep. He then deals in verse 6 with another practical issue, kind of on providence to some degree, and how we respond with that. He says, in the morning, sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. So part of it is going to be, in the morning, get up to your work. You gotta try to hustle. You gotta try to get it done. You have to sow the seed. Now, what does he mean in the evening, not withholding your hand?
Don't just lay back and say, okay, I've done enough, which has happened so many times, you know. Okay, and even within the church, you know, we can look around and, you know, we'll need somebody to clean the building, or we'll need somebody to mow the grass, or to make a repair on something, and maybe I'll do it once, and then I'm gonna sit back and let somebody else do that next time around. Or we think that instead of doing what we can to help someone else, I've already done a little bit, so I've done my part, now let someone else do theirs, when our part is all of it. It's not just a part of it, it's everything that we can possibly do. We do, because that's what God did when He put Christ on the cross. He done all that He could do. And now it's up to us, you know, to follow through and continue with that. So we can't just do a little bit, you know, and then sit back and wait. We have to continue to work. We plant a crop, then we have to hoe that ground. We have to keep the weeds out of it and make sure that it's taken care of. And it's the same thing, you know, with our brethren in Christ. You know, if we help to bring someone to Christ, then we need to be with them and help them through their rough time, because early on, there's a whole lot of changes going to happen in their life until they gain strength to stand, you know, on their own, basically. And even those who, you know, we think that we're strong and we can handle it, we not without each other. And that's why God has given us the church as a family, no matter where we are in this country or in the state or in the world. We can find a family, and we can gain strength, and we can have hope.
Is there a possibility here in verse 6 that he is also talking about the idea of generosity? In the morning, sow your seed, and the evening not withhold your hand maybe from somebody else? I think it's a possibility of this, whether or not he was talking about sowing in the morning and sowing in the evening, or sowing in the morning and showing generosity in the evening. If he's talking about generosity, do you always know what this, if you're generous, if you've just sown in the morning, do you always feel that you have the ability to be generous in the evening? That seed's gonna take a while to grow. If you did your cold winter plants back in February, you're not gonna be getting them until March or April. And if you sowed your summer plants in, help me out here, Brittany, May? She sowed stuff in May. We're not gonna see some of that until July or August. Do you always feel generous immediately?
No, it's not plentiful.
Yeah, not when it's not plentiful. I think he is talking here of that same idea of something. Whether it's, you work in the morning, you work in the evening, or you work in the morning and you still be generous. You do not know which one is going to prosper, this or that, or both will be equally prosperous. He mentions in verse 7 that light is sweet and it's pleasant for the eye to see the sun. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in all of them. And let him remember that days of darkness will be many, and all comes in there. Well, I try not to do it really quickly. So he goes from, it is sweet to see the light, to remember the days of darkness will be many. What is Solomon driving at?
Age.
Age? Okay. Okay. So for those who live up north, I think you guys are from Ohio.
Yeah.
How are the winters up there? Super sunny,
Dark
warm.
and Ohio's a little bit brighter than Pennsylvania where we lived at, because they had fewer days of sunshine in the winter.
I grew up in the Ohio Valley, the northern panhandle of West Virginia. We had 265 days of cloud cover annually. That's rough. That's rough. I know where you grew up in Canada. In the summertime, it gets light at 4:30 in the morning. It doesn't get dark until 10 at night, but that gets reversed. In summertime or in the wintertime, it doesn't get light until 8 or 9 in the morning, and it gets dark by 4:30, and is usually overcast the entire time. When things are like, when you get to see the sun, for those who live in, not Florida, I don't know, not in the Sunshine State. Do you enjoy the light when it's there? After a long, dark, cold winter, and it comes out and the grass starts to grow again in the spring. I think he's encouraging us. Light is sweet, it's pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. And remember that the days of darkness are for many. Are there always going to be good days? No. But when there are good days, do you rejoice in them, or do you let the bad days ruin your good days too? And there's a lot of people who are oddly content to let all their good days be bad days because their bad days are bad days. And Solomon is, again, how many times now? Is this 6 times through the book? He tells you eat and drink and rejoice and be merry, to enjoy the works of your hand. This is, again, one of those times here in verse 7, verse 8, where he reminded you when the sun does come out, when it is warm and you get to see the sun. Enjoy it. Don't let the darkness ruin the good times. Oh, we are out of time. I am sorry. I was enjoying Ecclesiastes so much until the cats came home. So,
You weren't going to let the darkness ruin it.
it's so sunny outside. Next week we'll pick up in verse 9. For those who are visiting with us, we have one bathroom that is through the door and that on the left-hand side. I mentioned that as one, simply for the fact that you can be thoughtful of other people as they also need to use the one bathroom. We'll take a quick 10-minute break and then we'll come back in for worship.